Welcome again to a post-election edition of Scherable. I'm your host, Bill Scher. It's our second post-election edition, but one after, I guess, post-election called edition. Sunday night on the back porch. I think we have a better handle on the election data. It's not totally in. There's still some number. There's still a lot of votes left in California and New York and Illinois and a few other, trickle of votes in a bunch of states, but the lion's share of what's out there are in blue states. So we'll probably want to circle back once literally all the numbers are in. But I think we can draw some conclusions, in my opinion. And in my mind, everything starts from the fact that, at least what's estimated, is a turnout of a little over 66%. Right now, I think we have about 149 million votes in, 149 million plus. And it looks like we're going to get up to or around 158 million. If you go to the Washington Post, they have a map of what they estimate is in and what is remaining. And I crunched all those numbers and got to 8.5 million left to count. And a little under 7 million of those in some of the bigger blue states. So if that holds, it will be the biggest turnout as measured by percentage of voter eligible population. Those are those registered. Since 1900, 120 years. And so that means the biggest voter turnout since women had the right to vote, and since the end of Jim Crow. And, it's not 100%. You can still talk about, technically speaking, there are votes left outstanding that one party or both parties could get. But if you're literally setting a record in the modern voting era, dating that to universal suffrage, if you got every vote you could get on both sides. This is essentially what America is. That's why when I hear critiques of, well, Democrats should have done, they should have done more outreach in the Rio Grande Valley, or as AOC has said, they should have done more with digital campaigning. Those arguments don't wash with me when you've literally reached the maximum one could expect to get. This is everybody getting their vote out, period. And when they do, this is what America looks like. So that initial shock of, how is it that Trump is overperforming the polls? How is it that these states are closer than we thought they were going to be? Well, the margins are what they are because America is what it is. This is what America is. And when Biden's going to probably crack 80 million, I think around 81 million votes when all is said and done. That'll get him over 51% of the vote if he gets to 81%. I think that's going to be about a 4.5 point margin, give or take. So, not quite landslide, but not real nail biter either. There are nail biters in several swing states, but nationally speaking, it's not really all that close. In that circumstance, I don't think that's because because they did something technically right in their campaign logistics. There just was an election that had very high stakes, and people on all sides were highly motivated to turn out. I thought perhaps we get a bigger blue wave because the Republican side might get demoralized. They'd see this cake was baked and they wouldn't bother showing up in robust numbers. I think that was not true. It's not what happened. So my firmest prediction was that Biden would win period, end of story, not even talking about the margin. My less firm, more hopeful prediction that it would be a bigger margin than this with more states. I thought they'd get Iowa. I thought Biden would get Iowa and North Carolina and Florida, and that didn't come to pass. And that's either because they were highly motivated, or just simply it was easier to vote with extra early in-person voting. They got what they could get. So, it may be that the Latino Hispanic community in the Rio Grande Valley just isn't as liberal as people assumed. That's a clearer picture, I think, in the Miami-Dade region with the Cuban American community. I probably want to see more reporting about the Rio Grande Valley before jumping to that conclusion. But to me, that's very plausible. That some people made some very lazy assumptions about the political tenor of these populations, and as we often say accurately, these communities are not monolithic. So from there, we can then move to what does this mean going forward? There's a lot of talk now about what should happen. What should we do in Georgia? I just had a little tweet story about this. There was some notion that the Stacey Abrams operation registered all these voters, and that's why Georgia is close. And I'm not making final pronouncements about this because I think I've only done a little bit of research into the subject. But you're seeing reported that Stacey Abrams' organizations got 800,000 new registered voters, and Biden's winning by 10,000 votes. So therefore, she should get the credit. But there's a New York Times story that describes Stacey Abrams' efforts, her organization's efforts, as inspiring 800,000 new registrants. Inspiring is not direct registration. Now, the Georgia Secretary of State's office last month had a press release saying that they have a record of 7.587 million registered voters, and 5 million of those are from automatic voter registration through their DMV, and that is a increase from November 2018 of 600,000 new voters. So there's one little weird thing that the 600,000 from the state's numbers is smaller than what we're hearing from the Abrams organization. Now that may not mean anything unethical. Maybe it's a net of the increase in the state. So Stacey Abrams has inspired 800,000, 200,000 people died or moved away, and you get 600,000. That might suggest that the Abrams organization is taking credit for the entire net through inspiration. And again, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth. I don't want to make accusations. I can't back up. I'm just telling you what the numbers I'm getting from these operations. But I think it's important because if that's just the number of everybody who's new, they're not all Democrats. So Biden got a handful more votes than the Abrams did in 2018, but John Ossoff got 100,000 less than Biden, and also less than Abrams. One reporter, Ryan Heath, tipped me off to that, who works at Politico. And that makes some sense if this whole bunch of new voters are not all Democrats. It's just all the people in the state who are new registrants. And so I'm getting into all this, not because I want to point fingers at anybody, but I mean, one, there's the question of just what is good for getting more people to vote. If it is walking around with a clipboard trying to get new people registered, great. But if it's not really that, if it's really automatic voter registration programs, then you want to get those things passed on a state by state level. And so it looks to me that the latter might be the case. But it also speaks to, what is it that made this voter turnout so big? And if it's not, individual GOTV operations grinding out the vote, it's just an organic reaction to the moment that we're in and easy voting rules. Even places like Texas, which we had all this focus on the governor limiting drop boxes. Meanwhile, they actually extended a week of early voting, and they broke early voting records. So, Georgia was a place that was accused of voter suppression 2 years ago, and I'm not condoning things that the government did there. But if they also had this automatic voter registration program that's juiced numbers and has possibly helped Biden win the state, that's relevant to note too. So my overall point there is, beyond what makes for good voter registration policies, as far as what it takes to win elections, Biden, in my opinion, won the overall argument and won it very early. One of the reasons I made my prediction that Biden will win ahead of time, even though predictions are in many ways kind of silly and often get you into trouble, was to point out that, and you're seeing this now, you're seeing articles, you're seeing spin, you're seeing bemoaning from Trump supporters. Oh, if only the pandemic didn't happen, or if only Trump did this with the pandemic, if only these things occurred, then maybe things would have been different. But as my initial article, which was in Real Clear Politics the day before the election, said, Trump was losing before the pandemic. Trump was always losing. Trump was never ahead of Biden. Trump's job approval was always underwater, literally since the beginning of his presidency. There's one day of the Real Clear Politics job approval average where Trump's job approval was above water, and it's literally the first day that average began, which was, I think January 27th, like a week after the inauguration. So that one day it was above water, and it was underwater every day since. And this is during the time when the economy was growing for pretty much the whole time before the pandemic. So if the public just was sick of Donald Trump, the pandemic was an opportunity for Trump to turn that around, to say, hey, what you thought about me was mistaken. Look, I'm a responsible person. I'm going to get us out of this difficult situation. Hey, if that happened, then yeah, those numbers might have changed. But of course, he did all the things that he is prone to do in being irresponsible. So winning that argument, having people already be predisposed to wanting to fire Trump, and have Biden put forth the kind of alternative people wanted, I will be a responsible, level-headed person and not drive us into a ditch. That's what leads to the result that you get. So what does that mean for Georgia? It's a little bit more complicated now because it's not Trump on the ballot. The presidency is decided. So you have to figure out, well, what is this election going to turn on? And when you look through the other Senate races, you don't see a lot of evidence in most places of all politics being local, as the old adage goes. And I tweeted this out the other day. You look at the number of the percentage of votes that each Democratic Senate candidate had in the competitive states, and compare that to Biden's percentage in that state. And in almost every case, it's within 2.5 percentage points. And not all, one way or the other. Some were a little better, some were a little less. The few people who went beyond that, Steve Bullock in Montana was at 4% better. And, one of my blown predictions was that Cunningham and Greenfield and Bullock would also win their Senate races. And my basic logic was that there wouldn't be a lot of ticket splitting. So Jamie Harrison couldn't get a lot of Trump voters. Barbara Bullier couldn't get enough Trump voters. MJ Hager couldn't get enough Trump voters. But I thought, one, Iowa, North Carolina would be Biden states, and so that wouldn't be a problem for them. And Georgia, I thought the Georgia race would go to runoffs. I thought Biden would win Georgia, but I wasn't convinced it would be by very much. And I wasn't convinced that with the third-party candidates in the mix, that Ossoff and Warnock had a jungle primary holder situation. I didn't think they could get to 50, so I thought they'd be runoffs. But I thought that Montana, while not going to be a Biden state, Bullock was an exception because he's the governor of the state. He's run for office 3 times before, statewide, and won. And I was correct in that Bullock was the best candidate compared to Biden's performance. It's just that the state was so red that wasn't sufficient. And Iowa, New Hampshire, Iowa, North Carolina were simply, red states. Although you can't totally count out North Carolina yet. There's still votes out there. Who we'll see. One of the other glaring exceptions was Maine. Now, Maine's the one place where things were more local. Susan Collins was someone with a bipartisan brand. Democrats had hoped that brand was permanently sullied, and therefore wouldn't allow her to survive. But Susan Collins, ran very vociferously with that brand, had a lot of ads testifying to her bipartisanship, helped with the coronavirus response relief package. Voted against Barrett at the end of the day before the election. And they also smeared the hell out of Sarah Gideon. And I mentioned this in the previous YouTube, all the Republican Senate campaigns, had character attacks against the Democratic Senate nominees. And there wasn't a lot of, it wasn't cookie cutter. There's some court packing from state to state that's more of a national issue, but they tend to find more localized things to try to pin on them with varying degrees of veracity, often very low veracity. And I'm sure that didn't help Gideon either. And her, like most of the candidates, are people who have not run statewide before, and so didn't have that level of connection with their own state. If you're going to defy gravity, if you're going to outdo your top of the ticket, if you're going to say I'm different than the national Democrats, you generally need that tie, that bond locally. If you're the fresh face thing, is can be a bit high risk, high reward. And not something that always pans out. So did not help Gideon. Even though she's main Speaker of the House, she wasn't the biggest outsider in the universe, but not born in Maine, something that people thought was the negative for her that Collins was able to exploit, and hadn't run statewide before. She's from a bluer area of the state and didn't have the same name recognition nationwide. So to get back to Georgia, here again, Ossoff never run statewide before, though had a lot of attention as a losing House candidate a few years ago. And Reverend Warnock is well known in the Atlanta area, but might not be as well known statewide. Now, the Atlanta and its suburbs, that's the Democratic hotspot. So if you can win there, the other big cities in the suburbs, that might be enough. It's not like Biden was crushing it in the rural areas. But what is the issue going to be? Obviously, the news is going to be about who controls the Senate. And we don't really know what the median Georgia voter thinks about that, and probably has not put much thought into it at all. And I'm not trying to tell people that they shouldn't knock on doors or phone bank or text or write letters or what have you. Anytime you have a tight race, a good ground game might make a difference in the matter of inches. And perhaps unlike the presidential election, the turnout is probably going to be lower. It might be high for a runoff or high for a special, but it'll probably be lower. And that may come down to which base wants it more. Are Democrats more determined to win control of the Senate, or are Republicans more determined to make sure Mitch McConnell retains control? And to the extent that people might vote who are not hardcore partisans, and this is where I think messaging is very important, how can you communicate that electing Ossoff and Warnock is going to lead to good results? Because as you see in Maine, this is a state that went for Biden by a heavy amount, but a good chunk of voters like the idea of somebody with a bipartisan mindset or the bipartisan track record sticking around. And I had a thing earlier trying to communicate to folks that if you want constructive bipartisanship, you should vote Democrat, because the more Democrats that win, the easier it is to get the 60 with a handful of Republican votes. Whereas if Democrats took the Senate with a narrow majority, that might embolden the more hyperpartisan part of the party. And that was a little counterintuitive. And it's like something counterintuitive. It's probably not going to be something that the median voter is going to readily grasp or even be aware of. So, one thing that Ossoff and Warnock can do is to say, we need people who are going to work across the aisle and get things done. And Perdue and Loeffler have been party line voters, voted with their party 94+% of the time. That's why you should vote for us. That's probably what I would do if I was in their situation. But it's still going to be a little tricky. It's going to be a little tricky to convey that you should vote for more Democrats in order to get more bipartisanship. And I think if you take a step back and look at the broader picture of what came out of the presidential election, is that Biden was able to put together, again, maybe not the biggest coalition of all of history, but to get 51% is not 56, 57%. There have been bigger landslides percentage-wise in history, and I'm not a huge fan of saying most popular votes ever, because I think percentages are more revealing than raw vote totals because there's population growth and such. But it still is a big tent coalition. It still encompasses people on the hard left and moderates and even some right-leaning voters. Biden's coalition does have geographic breadth. The fact that they did flip Arizona and Georgia and Nebraska too, and got back the Rust Belt. That's not irrelevant. That message did carry the day. And the hard part is now, since a good chunk of the country didn't embrace that message, that the people who are aligned with Trump and the general Republican Party posture is a significant number, that takes pressure off of McConnell to be cooperative. So that leaves us potentially in a hard situation unless Biden has some magical powers to thaw McConnell's heart, or other people inside the Republican Party say, look, we're not going to survive as a party if we do the obstructionist thing like we did in 2009. We have seats coming up in 2022, which are going to be vulnerable, and we need to show some seriousness of purpose here if we're going to keep those seats. I suspect there's going to be internal pressure on McConnell and possibly corporate pressure on McConnell. Big businesses, the donors of the Republican Party, saying, look, we can't go through what we just went through for the last 4 years. Yeah, we want low taxes and deregulation, but being in chaos doesn't serve our interest either. And so we need you to do your part. I suspect that's what's going to need to happen if there's going to be a shot at any kind of constructive bipartisanship. Looking at a couple of questions here in the live chat. Is America a center-right country or a center-left country with a rural bias? I mean, I would still say overall center-left. Biden's going to have the popular vote. Democrats have had the popular vote in presidential elections almost every single time, going back to 1992, lone exception being 2004. And they're going to win the House popular vote again. I mean, there's two national metrics here. There's presidential vote and House popular vote. The Senate is not a coast-to-coast vote. The fact that Democrats didn't take control of the Senate obviously is disappointing. And they may only end up flipping a net of one seat and maybe two or three. We'll have to see what happens in Georgia and also Alaska. Alaska's still out there, and in North Carolina is a little bit iffy, but most likely between 1 to 3. But this was a Senate election conducted on a Republican map. This almost all the activity was on playing offense on Republican turf, and we just learned that the Republican base in Republican states is pretty solid. So there's only so much inroads that can be made at the present time. But Democrats are going to not only keep the House, they're going to win the House popular vote. They're already ahead of it. I think they have a bit of a plurality right now, but I think once that California and New York and other numbers come in, they'll get over 50%. And I think it is possible that, as with 2018, that the House popular vote is going to track the percent of seats that they have. We keep talking about gerrymandering, warping the numbers. But we'll check back on this once we have all the final numbers. But it's looking to me like those numbers are going to be pretty close. Now, I also saw today, Sean Trendy talks about imputations when trying to interpret House popular vote. There are certain places, for example, like in Tennessee, if you're unopposed, they don't even count the votes. You're put in it with goose eggs. And there are other places where they count the vote where you're unopposed, but it's one-sided. So it overinflates the number, because if there was a Republican opponent, there would be some Republican votes there if it was a Democratic held seat, and vice versa. So there's ways to account for that and have a modified House popular vote. But he was suggesting that the changes probably would end up amounting to less than 1%. So again, I think we're going to see that the country is lean left, but it's not lean hard left. And within that center left element, a pretty healthy appetite for talk of bipartisanship, unity, and compromise. And that rural bias, as our commenter points out, it does get reflected in the Senate, because the Senate is affirmative action for small states. And that is what the founders intended. It's intended not to be a strict majoritarian government. If there is one body where the smaller states have disproportionate influence, well, that's what the plan was. And then the channel is the challenge is to make that work. So one other question here: any insight into the USPS role? It doesn't seem like, to me, I know as the commenter says, the judge forced USPS to do a sweep before the election. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like the intent of the USPS actions was to thwart the vote. I think USPS and DeJoy were trying to do things to accelerate a path to privatization of the Postal Service. That to me seems very, very logical. But by and large, I don't think we have seen evidence of ballots being lost altogether and not getting counted, at least not by any deliberate act of the post office or all that much accidental act of the post office. And certainly it hasn't, if the intent was there to use it to throw the election, well, it didn't work, because enough ballots came in Pennsylvania on time. Wisconsin was a state where the Supreme Court said you can't accept ballots that arrive late. The Wisconsin Supreme Court went out of bounds. It went beyond the state law, and you're not allowed to accept them after the election day. Didn't matter. Biden won the state anyway. And other states where they said you could, like North Carolina, they're going to get counted, and maybe something surprising is going to happen, and that state will end up tipping too. And Pennsylvania, they're accepting them for 3 days afterwards. And Alito said, surrogate them in case it gets litigated later, but I don't think it's going to get litigated later at this point. So all this stuff didn't end up amounting to enough to throw the election. And this is also true in terms of, we talk about voter suppression type stuff and Russian stuff, and not that these things, people don't try to do these things that not that they don't deserve to be reported on, and concerns shouldn't be raised about them, but they are things that can be tackled and be surmounted, often through motivation. When you have a high stakes election that people feel invested in the outcome of, people find a way to overcome these types of roadblocks. Other questions here. Will Pelosi remain as speaker? She said she is going to stand again, and I don't think you're going to see any significant challenge to her. The last one, of course, did not go very well, and it sort of goes beyond the question that you're asking. But you're seeing AOC putting herself out there to argue, don't blame us, don't blame progressives that talked about defund the police. We're not the reason why a handful of House moderates lost. And she's kind of out there by herself doing it. I don't feel like she is getting a lot of allies within the House caucus for doing that. I think you're finding most of the House caucus more sympathetic to the moderates who lost. And mind you, not that many moderates lost at this point. I mean, some of those races are still outstanding. And it was such a 2018 was such a successful House midterm that Democrats won in a lot of reach places, and in turn you're playing more defense because you've already made a lot of inroads. So it's not all that shocking. I mean, I didn't think it was going to happen, but if you told me in advance that Trump would be getting 47% of the vote, then I might think, oh, maybe some House people are going to go down, because that's going to be a modest margin for Biden, and that's going to mean that a lot of Trump turnout in these redder places. So Oklahoma 5 and South Carolina 1, those guys, probably wouldn't make it, and they didn't. Question here: Trump has till the 1st of January to contest the results. I don't know what the deadline is about that. I mean, if you recall Bush v. Gore in 2000, you have opportunities to contest the Electoral College results on the floor when they get ratified by Congress. But there's not going to be the appetite to actually do it. And actually, I mean, there was an appetite for it to be done in 2000, even though as angry as Democrats were. So. I would not be surprised to see Trump throw every possible thing he has at this and never formally concede. I could see Trump giving a speech next week where he says, not only do I not concede, I filed my reelection campaign for 2024, and it starts today. So you might see a nominal protest on the floor in Congress, as we saw in 2000. There, some Congress people did. The House members came to the Senate. They needed a senator to chime in to contest, and maybe some drama happens along those lines this time around. But I don't think it's gonna get anybody very, very far. It's gonna be more grist for Trump loyalists and things that they can rant about at rallies for the next 4 years. Question here: what do you think about progressives attacking moderates? See multiple claims Bernie would have won in a landslide. Not sure they figure that, but AOC looks ready for an inter-party fight. I mean, you're seeing elbows thrown both ways. You saw Abigail Spanberger complain that defund the police was dragging them down in their districts and made some people lose. And you're seeing AOC shoot back and saying, well, these moderates had bad digital campaigns, and I could have taught them how to do better digital campaigns. They didn't listen to me. And people saying, look, $15 minimum wage passed in Florida on a referendum. So don't say Florida has gone hard right. You gotta. So there's going to be those tensions inside the party, no doubt about that. I mean, that was going to be the case anyway. Probably with McConnell controlling the Senate, that makes it even harder for the AOC faction to kick up a lot of dust, because everybody knows you don't get anything done without getting Republican cooperation. So the whole nuclear option argument is moot. If Democrats do pull off control with Georgia, then they have a narrow 50-50. You're still not going to go nuclear because Manchin won't do it and Sinema won't do it, and you need literally every Democrat to do it, and that's not what's going to happen. You might get more complaining about that fact from the left, but it's still not going to happen. And I think this, because the whole race wasn't such a blowout, because the Trump faction is robust, a minority, but a robust minority. I think that spooks Democrats. I don't think the argument that more socialism, particularly because what happened in Miami-Dade, seeing a couple of Democrats who were in seemingly Democratic areas go down because of, partially Cuban American reaction to socialism. Yeah, that definitely scares some people straight, I think. So I don't think AOC is playing a lot of cards right now, even though she's trying her darndest to, spin her case. But it's going to be challenging if there is a bipartisan compromise for anything. It's not going to be what the most left-wing factions of the party want. Democrats in general, I think, are good compromisers. People on the left didn't love the Affordable Care Act. Obama had to lean on Dennis Kucinich to vote for it, but Kucinich did. And you might see AOC and Jamal Bowen, Cory Bush maybe not want to do what Kucinich did, but there's not that many of them. So I have a hard time seeing them being able to throw a lot of weight around. I hope that answers the question, if that was a long answer. I've probably been going on for a long time. One of my longer shareables. I hope I covered a lot of ground. I'm sure there's more to talk about as we keep picking through the data. And I'll be back, I'm sure, next week with another shareable. If you like this and want more, please click subscribe. Please support it financially on patreon.com/BillShare. And I'll talk to you all very soon. Take care, everybody.